Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the top 3 GOP governors who are at risk of losing their primary elections in the spring and summer primaries for the 2022 midterms. Now, there's a lot of discontent among the right-wing base with some governors around the country, some that are getting serious primary challengers and some that aren't. Voters that believe that these governors went too hard on COVID restrictions back in 2020. Or aren't right-wing enough for the state that they're in, and they want somebody with a fresh face. Now, normally when people get primary challenged, it usually means there's a discontent among a segment of the base, or even the base as a whole. A state that didn't make this list, but would have, perhaps in an alternate reality, would be the state of Massachusetts if Charlie Baker had decided to run again. There was a lot of speculation up until about 2 months ago as to whether or not Charlie Baker was going to run again. He was facing a pretty serious primary challenge from the Republican Senate nominee, Jeff Deal, who, lost to Elizabeth Warren by some 24 points in 2018. He was trying to primary Charlie Baker for the governorship in Massachusetts, and the polls looked pretty bad for Charlie Baker among the base. Charlie Baker is a popular governor in Massachusetts, but according to when you look at the polls for the base, he's not very popular. In fact, his popularity is higher among Democrats than Republicans. And, on the issues that Republicans care about, a lot of major social issues, Charlie Baker is certainly liberal on those issues, and that's obviously how he won. One of the reasons he won in a blue state like Massachusetts. You wouldn't have a pro-life, pro-gun Republican winning in a state like Massachusetts or Vermont anytime in my lifetime. So let's take a look at these 3 states. We're going to start off with the least likely governor to lose his primary, and that is Greg Abbott of the state of Texas. And then we'll move over to the governor that I believe is the most vulnerable to a right-wing challenger in the 2022 election. So in Texas, Greg Abbott has 2 main primary opponents, Allen West, who's a former Texas GOP chair, and Don Huffines, who is a former state senator. Taking a look at some of the polling, while these candidates have gotten some steam, and there's a few polls that have Allen West ahead, a lot of them are by, it seems almost all of them are by the same polling firm, which I've never even heard of, which has him up 33, 36, 35, 38, 43. But there's no other poll that, really reflects this data, really replicates this anywhere else. If we look at some of the hypotheticals, Greg Abbott gets in some cases 69%. Don Huffines, these other people only getting 3%. So while there's some polls that when you see them at first make it look like Greg Abbott is very vulnerable, he actually doesn't appear to be vulnerable at all. If you take out these outlier polls where you have Allen West for some reason doing 43%, and these results can't be replicated in any poll. There's some poll where he gets maybe 20 or 17 or 13, nowhere near 30 or 40%. So it seems like a lot of noise. There are certainly some people that are not fond of Greg Abbott. They think he could be better on issues like big tech, and one of the reasons that is he's a governor of a state where a lot of tech companies are moving to. And there's a significant segment of the right-wing base of the Republican Party that wants to see him do more about companies cracking down on perceived free speech violations. So, I don't really think Greg Abbott is that vulnerable. If we look at his 2018 performance, he outperformed all of the other Republicans on the ballot pretty spectacularly. He won by almost 13 points, over 13 points rather. Against his Democratic opponent, Lupe Valdez. This was the same ballot in which Ted Cruz almost lost to Beto O'Rourke. I mean, he won by, over almost 3 points, but that's a tiny margin for a state as red as Texas. And, a margin like we saw with Greg Abbott is something that's a lot more predictable. Now, if we look at the general election polling with Abbott in it, he's faring very well, pretty well against his Democratic opponent, Beto O'Rourke. He's leading by around 10 points. And I think, in my last Texas gubernatorial prediction, I had this race as safe. I think it is probably going to be a safe margin when it's all said and done. Beto O'Rourke kind of already exhausted, I think, a lot of his momentum in his previous 2 campaigns. Of course, he had his Senate campaign in which he almost won the Senate seat from Texas, one of the Senate seats from Texas. And of course, the presidential campaign that, ended in a spectacular failure for him. He didn't even make it to the primary states at all. He kind of crashed and burned and kind of fell off at 3% or something. So obviously, Greg Abbott's in a strong position for Republicans in the state of Texas. If this aggregate keeps up, a lot of these polls are better for him. The polls were getting a little closer at first when the power failures that happened in early 2021 were still fresh in people's minds. But as time goes on, it seems people are more likely to have a more positive view of Greg Abbott as a whole. And he looks to be on track to win the Texas governor's race by a pretty convincing margin. The next state we're going to take a look is the state of Ohio. Now, Ohio, Governor Mike DeWine has really one main primary challenger, and that is by a former U.S. rep named Jim Renacci. He was the 2018 Senate nominee for the Republicans. He was beat by incumbent Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown by a pretty decent margin for a state that went to Trump by 8 points last year. Sherrod Brown is still relatively popular in the state of Ohio, and Sherrod Brown ultimately lost that race by around 7 points. So going into the primary elections, Mike DeWine was looking to be in a lot of trouble. Now, there's two smaller polling agencies. Again, they're probably going to be almost all Republican leaning because, this is a Republican primary. But there's only two polls where we have Mike DeWine leading. Now, one of them he's leading by a lot. That's the Trafalgar Group. He's leading 41-23. But in all the other polls conducted, Mike DeWine is either losing or he's only in the lead by around 5 or less. Now, regardless, I think these are very poor numbers for an incumbent. Even if Mike DeWine does win, which he very well could with the vote splitting, there's 3 other people on the Republican ballot. It's very likely that Mike DeWine at the end of the day wins this because of the vote splitting of the other candidates. If he fails to get a majority, that almost confirms that it's very likely that Mike DeWine could have lost if he was only up against one other person like Jim Renacci. The Ohio Republican base is very discontent with Mike DeWine. He's certainly not as liberal as somebody like Charlie Baker, but he went against COVID pretty aggressively, instituted a lot of, quote unquote, harsher measures for a red state. It was one of the few red states that took a very hardline approach against COVID. And a lot of Republican base voters didn't appreciate that, and that's why they're coming out in force against the current governor. Now, the question is, can he maintain his seat? Certainly. We kind of need to see more polling on this, though, because the only polls we have so far, there seems to be only from like 4 different groups. So, again, you're not going to get a ton of polls in a Republican primary, but the latest poll we have has Renacci up by 1, so it really is a toss-up race. There could be undecided voters that break for DeWine just because they recognize the name, these primary voters, so that could be something in his favor. But it definitely seems to be right now that the amount of primary challengers against him seems to be a good thing, because it seems to be more likely that the vote is going to be split and he's going to come out with the largest plurality just because he's the most well-known and probably has the most support, just being the guy that's already in office to begin with. So when we go back to 2018, Mike DeWine won his last election by a little bit less than 4 points. Again, this is the same year that Sherrod Brown won his election by around 6 or 7. So, obviously underperformed Trump, but it was a blue wave year. There were higher turnouts among Democrats. Northeastern Ohio was not nearly as red as we saw in 2020, so a lot bluer there. But ultimately, he still won out. Now, Mike DeWine is a former senator. He was a senator back in the early 2000s. Lost, I believe, in 2006 to Sherrod Brown, interestingly enough. But, the polls are indicating, at least in the general election, that he's in a very strong position to win this race. In fact, in all but one poll, he's leading by a overwhelmingly safe margin. So, again, we have Jim Renacci still leading, probably by a likely margin. It would be a closer race. But if Mike DeWine does end up being the nominee, this is definitely going to be a safe seat that Democrats are not going to win. And finally, we're going to take a look at the state of Georgia. Now, this was probably one of the, most mean-spirited primary campaigns. Of course, you had all that drama surrounding the 2020 election where, President Trump had asked Kemp to intervene personally in the electoral process in the state of Georgia. He refused to do that, and as a result, there is a decent segment of the Republican base in Georgia that, absolutely hates his guts, even though on policy, Brian Kemp is probably one of the more conservative governors in terms of what he supports in the legislation he's been pushing. So David Perdue, who is the senator that lost the special Senate election back in early 2021, he has seen an opportunity to make a political comeback. He is currently primarying Brian Kemp, and the polls are very close. Brian Kemp in the aggregate is leading by about 6 points or so. So about 6 points, 5.3%. The Trafalgar Group poll has Brian Kemp up by 9. That's the latest poll, but this certainly is an unstable sort of primary. This could go either way. I think Brian Kemp does have the advantage, but David Perdue is a big name in the state of Georgia. He has the backing of President Trump, but I've put this as the most vulnerable because this certainly has gotten the most attention. It certainly has the most money going towards it. And of course, you've got two really big names. I mean, Jim Renacci is a sort of big name in Ohio, but again, he lost his race. Brian Kemp actually was a senator for 6 years. So both these candidates are very well known, but Brian Kemp has been at the helm for about 4 years, and it looks like at least a plurality of Republican voters want him to stay there. Now, Kemp is still in the lead. Before David Perdue jumped in the race, it didn't look like Kemp was going anywhere. You had a lot of, other Republicans trying to primary him early on, like Vernon Jones, who ended up dropping out, I think, recently, because he knew it was kind of a hopeless bid. If we look at the general election polling, Kemp seems to be the Republicans' best shot at statewide victory. He's leading in every single poll against Stacey Abrams. Of course, Vernon Jones was losing to Stacey Abrams. Not a lot of people, even in Georgia, know who he is. He just made a national name for himself for being, the Trump-supporting Democrat that became a Republican like 2 years ago. Doug Collins, obviously, Marjorie Taylor Greene. These people aren't actually in the race. These are all hypothetical polls. But, David Perdue, he's leading her by 4 in one poll, and then there's one poll where he's losing. Brian Kemp seems to be the strongest contender against Stacey Abrams, leading by an average of 4.5%, and leading all the polls. There's not even a single poll where it gets closer than 3 points. That's just about the margin of error. So Brian Kemp seems to be in a better position, and I think this is due to the national environment. The national environment is going to be pretty favorable to Republicans in 2022. Again, that's according to the conventional wisdom. In 2018, Brian Kemp won his race by just 1.4%. It was a very close race, but it was during a blue wave year. And Brian Kemp, is not necessarily the most popular governor, but again, midterm elections are going to come out to turn out. I think the approval rating of governors is probably going to mean the least when it's all said and done for most of these statewide races. Again, even somewhat popular governors like Laura Kelly, for instance, in Kansas, might probably end up losing just because of the national environment. And of course, in my gubernatorial prediction, I had her losing by even a likely margin. I think it's very likely that a lot of these, particularly these governor's races, go even more red than the Senate races because, they're mostly focused on local issues. A lot of states tend to lean a little bit more conservative statewide, and that's one of the reasons why I think, as of right now, Brian Kemp probably will win his race in Georgia by a lean margin. So, again, I just have him as the most vulnerable because David Perdue is a pretty formidable challenger. Although we're starting to see that momentum fade away. We're also, Ohio, it really is kind of a tricky one to gauge because you have polls where Jim Renacci is up, but the latest polls we're seeing, Mike DeWine is actually doing fairly well. There's one where he's the last three he's leading, and then there's one where he's leading by over 20 points. So that's why I have Georgia as the most vulnerable right now. Of course, we'll have to see how the primaries go. I will be making primary election predictions for all of these states as they come up. Of course, we have Texas coming up in March. That's going to be my first prediction. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.